for us, one of the biggest surprises was we went to the Carbon Trust, who are probably the most rigorous organisation we've come across globally around assessing it. And they assessed CCM's 2023 fertiliser manufacturing emissions. And they compared it with a commercial equivalent, a synthetic chemical, where we were indicated to somewhere between 1.2 and 2 tonnes of emissions per tonne of product for the synthetic. So we were hoping to be maybe 70% better than that. So when the Carbon Trust in November 23 came with a negative number, that's a significant step forward where we're able to ring Pepsi and say, actually, there were no manufacturing emissions from the fertiliser that your farmers used in 2023 to grow potatoes for the Walker's Crisp brand.
Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And this week, I am really excited to be joined by Pavel Kizilevsky, who is CEO of CCm Technologies. Now, we hunted Pavel down to some extent because we're really interested in the technology which mixes CO2 from industrial activities with other materials, organic materials, to make low carbon fertilizers. So that's what we're going to dive into today. But Pavel, could I ask you to kick us off with a little bit of a kind of insight into both the personal reasons and professional reasons that have meant that you've ended up working on this kind of technology at this point in time? What's the background to this for you?
Alex, I don't feel too hunted, by the way, just so you know. I don't feel too harassed. Look, how this came about, I'm now in my third career. I started as a soldier many years ago and then was an investment banker. And if one's truthful, nobody really cared a jot what I thought about when I was an investment banker, but life luckily goes in circles and we're back here. How this business set up was because it started at the school gates. Professor Peter Hammond, who's the genius behind this business, and I had children at the same school who are very good friends. Part of the reason why we can't argue, we're not allowed to because our children won't let us. But Peter rang me and said, look, I've got some intellectual property around the use of CO2, which is why we're a carbon capture and utilization business at our core. You're in finance. How do I fund my business? Or I don't even have a business. How do I fund this IP? So we built a company around Peter's intellectual property 11 years ago. And that was the sort of genesis. As I said, I spent most of my career in investment banking. Certainly wasn't very cool. And I now find myself in a business that is cool. Okay, who knew?
That's a good intro. And I like the idea of having sundry children just controlling the borders of the business as well. That's a good setup. So we'll obviously get into what your, CCM's approach and so forth, but just to give the lie of the land, what's the kind of the challenge that you're confronting, and specifically in this kind of ferts and agricultural space? Let's just sort of get that out on the table so that we have some context for what comes next.
So just to give you the scale of it, about 215 million tonnes of fertiliser are used around the world, to give you a sense of scope. The emissions that come from fertiliser come from two forms. One is when you actually make the fertiliser, there are emissions that come from that. And then the emissions that come in the field. And for me, coming from finance, I was always staggered and still remain fairly staggered by the fact of such an expensive product is so wildly inefficient. On a good day, only 50% of the nutrients in a fertiliser pellet will ever reach the root ball of the plant. Question, of course, is where's the other 50% go? And that is either into the atmosphere in harmful nitrous oxide gases and damaging air quality for you and me, or it leaches and runs off in groundwater and rivers. And we've seen the contamination in all sorts of rivers, whether it's the river that runs from North Carolina down to Florida and creates the algal blooms from the pig muck that's at the source, or whether it's the River Wye and the Usk in the West Country from chicken litter. So all of these are the sort of big issues, but 215 million tonnes of fertilizer consumed every year. The emissions from the manufacturing piece at the best is the Norwegian manufacturer Yara, who uses quite a lot of hydro, who has a carbon footprint of about 3.6 tonnes of emissions per tonne of product. And yes, I did say it that way, 3.6 tonnes per tonne of product. all the way up to North America, where it's probably 6.5, 7 tons of emissions per ton of product, and God knows what it is in Russia and China. So if you multiply 215 million tons by, let's take the average of 5, you're getting to quite a big number.
So we have that kind of eye-watering stat to start us. But kind of, I guess the next layer of the context before we dive into you is then who this affects. So obviously it affects us all in the context of climate, but in a kind of very commercial value chain sense, what are the brands, what are the types of products and so forth that are most kind of attuned to the need to move on these emissions, because it's obviously a key part of their value chain. Who are we talking about?
I'll start with ours, but really there are 4 sectors that this technology impacts, which are 4 quite big sectors, so you'll see why it's relevant. So the food manufacturers, the Pepsi, Nestle's, Heineken of the world, the retailers, so Tesco's and Sainsbury's and Walmart and others, the water companies, and I'll explain why that becomes relevant, so all the big water companies anywhere around the world. And then finally, the surprise package for us last year was the introduction of oil and gas majors. Oil and gas majors, as part of their greening up, if that's the right expression, have been investing in renewable natural gas, RNG. And so we saw BP spend $3.4 billion a couple of years ago buying America's largest RNG producer, Archeria. Shell countered with Europe's largest one called Nature Energy, which is a Danish company. And I think they spent 2 billion euros, roughly, maybe 18 months ago. And others are making similar announcements. So oil and gas is the 4th of the major sectors that we interact with. But, ultimately, this is, from the customer's point of view, this is all around Scope 3 carbon emissions. When you come up with a circular economy solution, as we have, you never quite know who the drivers are going to be. Do we have to convince the farmers? And yes, we do. But do we have to convince governments? Do we have to say to them, you need to subsidize this technology in the way you did solar and wind to get it off the ground, to make it accountable and financially economic? Well, no is the answer. You don't in this case, but the real drivers have been the Scope 3 carbon emission reduction ambitions of people like PepsiCo.
So within this kind of landscape that you're painting, where does CCM fit? And just give us the kind of the intro to the business again. I know you've talked about CCU, but what exactly is it that you are doing, and which part of that value chain do you interact with the most?
Well, we always set out, our ambition was to produce a fertiliser pellet that a farmer would recognize when he slit the bag and put it into his hopper on the back of his tractor. So we have always set out the ambition to create a direct analogue of a chemical fertiliser. Chemical fertilizers have been used now for 6 decades, and without them, we wouldn't have the food that is required to feed the world. So they play a very important role. But there are, of course, downsides. As I say, huge emissions come from fertilizer manufacture, but also the impact on soil. Soil fertility is being damaged by the use over decades of chemical toxic fertilizers. I mean, it's just the thing. And the estimates are that every year, industrialized farming techniques rip out of the soil about 0.5% of soil organic matter. And that's why you see relatively terrifying headlines that the United Nations puts out that we have 60, 80 harvests left. Or the other stat they put out is the damage to topsoil. I mean, that's brown gold. Without topsoil, we are nothing. And they are suggesting that you are losing significant amounts of topsoil, that by 2050, there will be none left. We're losing, around the world, 1 football pitch of topsoil every 5 seconds. Now, that's the sort of scale of the drama. Where does CCM fit in? We are able, as I say, to create a direct analog fertilizer for a farmer that produces the same yield outcomes. Means he doesn't have to change his farm machinery, critical. He's paying the same price, and normally in circular economy solutions, somebody ends up paying the penalty to do the right thing. Either government subsidies, we the consumer, because we have to pay more for whatever the product is. In this case, that's not necessary. And the farmer is also getting 2 major outcomes. in addition to not having to change his farm machinery or the way he farms his land, he's growing a product which is net zero, has no carbon impact. So those are the products that the end purchasers like Pepsi want more than anything else. And then critically, the second piece is that he's actually starting to reinvigorate his soil organic matter. And the one thing we know about nature is that if you give it a chance, give it space, it will restore itself faster than you can possibly imagine. And I think by starting to reintroduce soil organic matter in this product back into soil, we will start to reverse this trend of negative toxicity in the soil.
So is your route to market, is it direct, the main relationship is with, farmers, a big kind of larger scale farmers, or do you go via those companies that are most concerned about scope 3? What's the reality of that the dynamic of that bit of the value chain you're in?
Well, I'd love to tell you it was part of my business strategy along with Peter to go and the route we've taken, but I would be lying. We were lucky that Tesco's introduced us to PepsiCo, two different, I often confuse Tesco's and Pepsi, as you can tell. But Tesco's had a conversation with Pepsi and they said, oh, this sounds a bit interesting. And we had a first conversation with Pepsi on the 8th of January, 2020. And we'd signed a deal with them within 8 months. Now, for a big company like Pepsi, that is outrageously fast. And it just gave us an early indication that these guys were willing to be the lead steer, the drivers behind the movement. And all along the way, Pepsi has always said they do not wish to be exclusive. They wish to be able to work with other people in the industry. And it's quite well documented that they do work with other FMCG, fast-moving consumer good companies. And I think that's yet another testament to their attitude to make things change. So to answer your question specifically, we didn't plan to go to the Pepsis of the world, but we have. And those are the drivers, because they're the ones that are really being driven around the scope 3 carbon emission reductions.
I know when we initially did the prep call, prep contact for this podcast, you also were mentioning the impact that CBAM has had on client discussions. And if we think about that timeline, so 2020, that conversation with Pepsi, it's definitely obviously gathered pace, CBAM, right up until its implementation last year, she says, hopefully. So how is that coming into discussions, and why is that becoming such a driver?
Okay, so let's explain that CBAMs are excitingly known as carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And Europe introduced CBAMs, which will become fully enforceable in 2026. In October of last year, the UK did it in December 23 and will become fully enforceable in 2027. And what this is impacting any import of steel, iron, glass, fertilizers, critically, ceramics, into either the EU 27 or to the UK from a jurisdiction that is not as compliant from a carbon intensity point of view. And there will be a levy imposed on those imports. Now, to be honest, CBAMs is still with the policymakers. As I say, it was introduced as a concept at the end of last year and will become fully enforceable. So a lot of the understanding of exactly what the policies are going to dictate are still being worked through. But I think in terms of just the impact, there was a Financial Times article that quoted the chief executive of the world's largest fertilizer company, Yara, Norwegian company, saying that, first of all, they quoted that the EU imported 2 times as much urea, a type of fertilizer, from Russia in the 12 months up to June 2023 than it had in the previous 12 months. So the CEO of Yara said Europe is ironically sleepwalking into becoming dependent on Russian fertilizer. That's quite a dramatic statement. He also went on to say fertilizer is the new gas, obviously making reference to what happened with Germany and their reliance on Russian gas. So the reason for saying that is I think CBAMs is all around geopolitics as well. I think food security meets geopolitics is a really important dynamic. where we fit in as a company is that we are taking waste streams that are existing within a current jurisdiction and turning those waste streams that are already within our own economy to create fertilizer, to grow the food that we need. There was an interesting report out of some research done by the European Union last year, which said that 83% of all the nutrients required to grow Europe's food are already being captured in European waste management systems. It's just they're not being converted into fertilizer yet because the technology hasn't been there. We have now commercialized that technology.
So let's sort of dig in a bit more into the actual technology that you have. So you talked about this kind of 11-year phase that you've been through, from idea of, how do you protect and fund the IP, through to now where you're really scaling up. So how have you done that? What has it taken to bring this technology to scale? And then perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some of the sources that you're using as well. What are the sources of that CO2 that you're creating this value from?
Okay, first thing I'll do is apologize because I'm not a scientist and I don't even have basic chemistry at school. So this is going to be at a simplistic level. But as always with technology, it's never a straight path. So when we first started this technology, it was around using the same intellectual property, but to create the functional fillers that are existing in plastics. So if you imagine a plastic tube that has fiber optic cable running it, 30–40% of the mass of that plastic pipe will be a functional filler. Either glass fiber, if it's not a high value product, or if carbon fiber, if it is. We were able to use waste streams bound together by CO2 to replace those. And that was all interesting 8, 9, 10 years ago. But actually, there was not a lot of pressure on corporates to do anything about that. So, of course, as a small company, we were burning cash like crazy. So we made the switch to fertilizer. We have 3 other applications of the technology which are coming along just nicely around power storage, heat storage, power generation, and the plastics product. But we decided to commercialize the fertilizer about 8 or 9 years ago, 9 years ago. And that's really where the genesis has come. And to try and just explain the technology very simply, we need 3 inputs. We need a source of CO2, we need a source of waste ammonia, and a fiber. And again, this is a podcast without video, so trying to explain this will be interesting, but let me just have a go. In the first instance, the fiber is purely there as a substrate host, i.e. little short fibers, and there's a lot of surface area that you can put ammonia molecules on. So in the first instance, fiber is purely there as the substrate host. We then coat that with a lot of ammonia, hopefully waste ammonia, so therefore we're extracting that from waste streams. And then you pass CO2 over that material. And CO2 and ammonia naturally react. You don't have to put it under temperature, you don't have to put it under pressure, you don't have to add catalysts or enzymes. It's just the thing. It's a natural chemical reaction. Now, that's good in one way and bad in another. It's good because it's an exothermic reaction, so that molecules bumping against each other will create a little bit of net zero energy. The bad news is that it will reverse, that chemical reaction will reverse under certain conditions. Mainly heat, if it gets too hot. So we need to do a second chemical reaction, which is to add a calcium salt. And there are many types of calcium salts to basically finish off that second chemical reaction and stabilize all of those nutrients. That allows us to basically end up with a pellet, which is about 50% organic matter. That's good for the soil. And then the rest is the nutrients, ammonium nitrate and calcium carbonate, chalk to me, which are embedded in that organic matter that provide you with the nutrition on a very predictable basis for the farmer. So this is also very important to note that this is not about us saying to a farmer, our inputs this week were X, Y, and Z, so therefore the fertilizer we're offering you is Y. This is around a mixing and blending, so we are able to adjust the formulation around NPK, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Because we move further and further into precision farming, and we need to be able to understand what the farmer grew last year, what they're growing this year, what the soil conditions are, whether it's wetter, which obviously it is right now, to be able to amend that formulation so he's getting the maximum impact of the fertilizer. So this is where we come in. The CO2 can either come from a chimney, post-combustion. So we did it with landfill gas generators that were belching atmospheric CO2, or we take it from biogas separation. So as we know, there's a growing demand in anaerobic digestion. And the good news of anaerobic digestion is that they are burning the methane for energy. And the biogas that comes off anaerobic digestion is about 55, it's 50-50 nearly in terms of methane and CO2. The good news is you're burning the methane. Bad news are you're popping near 100% purity CO2 into the atmosphere. We will never use all of that CO2, but we will use a good chunk of it. And so it is ultimately a waste stream, as is the ammonia, as is the fiber. So we're bringing together multiple waste streams bound together with the CO2 to provide something that is ultimately critical for growing crops.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. So those are the types of waste CO2 that, I mean, I'm going to narrow in on the CO2 in particular rather than looking at the ammonia piece, if that's okay. But those are the main types of waste stream you're using, CO2 streams you're using at the moment. Does it matter for your technology, you know, what the concentration is or what the nature of that stream is? Because, you know, in other forms of CCU or CCS, quite a lot of our industrials get, you know, quite anxious about what the percentage CO2 they have to offer is, or what else might be in their flue gas and so forth. How does that impact CCM and its approach?
Well, we're not that fussy, to be honest. There are a couple of things. It's concentration and purity. And, you know, there is a market developing a lot for the food grade CO2, you know, put the bubbles in the, you know, in the Coke or whatever. We don't care. We're completely agnostic. We can take the manky CO2. It's absolutely no problem at all. In terms of concentration, we can and have done for a number of years taken the CO2 that comes from a Cummins engine, so one of these big Perkins Cummins engines, where the CO2 concentration is somewhere between 9 and 10%, 9 and 15% of the flue gas that's coming out and being emitted to atmosphere. But to be honest, the biogas is our preferred method because you're getting a pure stream of CO2, normally very close to where our plant will be situated. And so it's easier to strip that off. But we're absolutely not, we don't require food grade CO2 or anything like that.
Okay, so that's the kind of the shape, the kind of nature of the process. When you just one kind of doesn't have to be a super techie answer, but I know I would be remiss not to ask this because quite a lot of times when we have, again, a CCU platform on the podcast, what people are always interested in is how much space does this take up? You know, if I have a biogas plant or I have a plant that kind of matches what you're doing, what's the sort of, you know, how do we imagine that what space is going to be required for the technology? And I get, again, we are an audio podcast, not a visual one, so I'm sorry about this, but do your best to describe that.
Yeah, it's fairly straightforward. We think about the production output, first of all, in the sort of 30,000 tons of fertilizer at the back end of a biogas plant as a sort of standard minimum. Our next one will be 85,000 and somebody's just about to build a 100,000 one. But just if we take the 30,000 ton, because that's where the economics really start to fly. We're looking for 500 square meters of covered space, and that will include space for all the inputs at the front end, so they don't get wet, and all the fertilizer that's being produced at the back end. So 500 square meters of covered space is, frankly, in the great scheme of things, not that large. I think a lot of people assume it'll be much larger than that, but you know, because you're not having to manufacture ammonia, which is where the big cost and the big space comes in. This is a relatively small add-on to a lot of plants. So we retrofit or we get built into the designs for a new plant. We don't care, either way works for us.
Okay, well then you've given us that sense of what it is that you're doing. Tell us a little about what you've learned from what you're doing. So you said 9 years really since you made the decision to start commercializing this particular strand of IP. What have been the kind of some of the takeaways or some of the adaptations that have been required in that time?
Partly we use 9 years because we've done 9 years of independent field testing. Not us, but other people have done it, with the end aim that we wanted to create a direct analog fertilizer. So the first impact, we just didn't want a farmer to say, oh, well, I'm going to have to change my machinery, or it's all going to be a bit difficult. We want to try and make it as easy. So it looks the same in terms of the pellet size and all that good stuff. So that was the first thing we learned, and that was fine. But I think we've also learned that if, I know, a big brand like Pepsi rings up a farmer who is growing, I don't know, potatoes, as many people know, Pepsi does more than just make fizzy drinks. They have twice the market share in crisps around the world than anybody else, 15.6% market share. So they grow a lot of potatoes, or their farming supply chain grows a lot of potatoes. If they ring up a potato farmer or a corn farmer and says, we'd like you to use this low carbon alternative, the next thing that farmer is going to do is pick up the phone to their agronomist and say, really? Is that what you want us to do? So we've done a lot of work with the agronomy groups to make sure that the farmer rings up and they'll go, yeah, we get it. We understand this. This is waste-based low carbon fertilizers. And yes, we understand exactly what the outcome is. The UK's largest agronomy firm and also supplier of fertilizer seeds and grains called Frontier Agriculture, I think when they first met us 3 years ago, thought we were snake oil salesmen. But because they are the largest in the UK, they have to make sure that they understand the horizon of what's coming up. They did probably the most complex trials on wheat that we've done over 9 years. And when we went in to go and see them at the conclusion, they said, what you do is you give a farmer exactly the same performance characteristics as a synthetic chemical fertilizer, but without the carbon footprint. And we went, no, we do more. We do less applications, low applications. We do stuff for soil fertility. And they went, yeah, whatever. Absolutely you do. But the first critical thing for the farmer. So that we learned an interesting lesson. I think the conversations with Frontier have now developed further that they are certainly putting value onto the amount of benefit that's coming for soil fertility. But we do have to understand at the beginning, when you bring a new product in, that it is sometimes quite tricky to make users of the product, in this case farmers, who are relatively conservative with a small c, although I think that's a misnomer. Sometimes I've come across farmers who are just so forward-thinking it's ridiculous. But I think there is an element of that changing practice requires some confidence, and you need to be able to prove that. So that was one of the big lessons. The other thing I would probably say is around the customers, the Pepsis. And, you know, there is the guy who runs Pepsi and has done for a number of years is a man from Barcelona called Roman Laguta. He is absolutely driving this from the top. And so when we met with him, the CEO of Pepsi Europe, the global chief sustainability officer, and a number of other executives, he said, how do we 20x what we do with CCM? Now, when people like that and Mark Schneider at Nestle and other senior leaders drive the agenda, it means that middle managers don't have to waste time thinking about whether they're going to use up their political capital driving some new funky sort of weird thing. So I think what we have learned is some of these particularly progressive leaders like Ramon at Pepsi are absolutely the key drivers here, and that's allowing the people within their organization to push this faster than would otherwise be the case.
So let's also then look at the kind of scale up of your own process and technology. I mean, I actually should know this, and I apologize I don't, but what's the kind of production capability that CCM has now versus 2 years ago, and how is that scale up pace going for you?
Well, 250 million tons global consumption. We are not really even a rounding error on it at the moment. We're sold out for this year, 2024. And we have basically got a full order book for next year. But that's not actually a very good thing, having full order book for next year, because people need the material. So we are growing capacity fast, and we're getting a lot of support from some of our FMCG customers as well, which has been extremely invaluable and somewhat unexpected, but also some of the financial institutions with whom I used to work, who are seeing sustainable finance as the great new opportunity. And I think that's very, particularly Bank of America, where I used to work. Brian Moynihan, who runs that business, again, is yet another driver of the momentum behind this, as they see opportunities within sustainable finance. So for us, as we are this very capacity constraint this year, we'll need to put on capacity very fast. Our next plant will have 85,000 tons, as I mentioned earlier, and somebody else is going to license the technology and build 100,000 ton deployment next year. So the end of this year. The capacity will come on, but we'll have a long way to go yet before we're really putting a dent in the global consumption numbers.
Okay. Well, let's just go back to something you said a little earlier in the conversation. You were talking about, the reality that in most green product markets, someone is having to pay a premium, someone's having to do something above and beyond. What's the reality here? Obviously, you've already explained that in terms of how it's applied, it's like for like. How does the product match up in terms of cost, and where does that cost really get picked up? Who is someone paying the green premium, and if so, who? How's that working out for you?
Because we're using waste inputs, our input costs are lower, which is why we're currently in a position where we can price match existing synthetic chemical fertilizers. But the question for us, of course, is if you're going to do significantly more beneficial things around soil fertility and others, I mean, maybe this is a premium product. But right now, as a new product into the market, I think it's reasonable to think that you're going to price match and sort of climb the stairs on the price. Now, normally it's the other way around. You don't want to climb the stairs because it's very difficult. But if you can prove sustainable benefits to soil fertility, lower emissions, then I think there's a real chance here. So I think for us, there are a couple of things. First of all, the big customers want the data that allows them to have credibility that they are making those Scope 3 carbon reductions. So while we initially thought we might produce some fancy dashboard that gave them some readings and put it into context, the reality is that Pepsi will have a different mechanism with their own consultants, as will Nestle or Heineken or Cargill. We will provide them with the raw data that allows them to have credibility. And you've only seen the announcement in the papers this morning around Shell and the carbon credits and what was going on in the shale oil in North America, to tell you that carbon credits are going through an extremely difficult period. I think this is, as we would normally see in cycles of new developments, this is the Wild West show of carbon, and we've sort of reached the end of phase 1.0. And I think there will be some consolidation and some stabilization as we move into the next phase. For us, this is around providing certainty on the data. And for us, one of the biggest surprises was we went to the Carbon Trust, who are probably the most rigorous organization we've come across globally around assessing it. And they assessed CCM's 2023 fertilizer manufacturing emissions, not the infield, just the manufacturing. And they compared it with a commercial equivalent, a synthetic chemical, where we were indicated to somewhere between 1.2 and 2 tons of emissions per ton of product for the synthetic. So we were hoping to be maybe 70% better than that. So when the Carbon Trust in November 23 came with a negative number, that's a significant step forward where we're able to ring Pepsi and say, actually, there were no manufacturing emissions from the fertilizer that your farmers used in 2023 to grow potatoes for the Walker's Crisp brand. That's a big deal. Now, they said, actually, trying to understand what zero and negative means, let's just go with the zero. Negative is all a bit sort of a challenge, but it is very critical as we move into this very skeptical world of should we be having offsets and insets, and are those carbon credits actually real, that you're able to provide very credible data, which I think was the big, huge success story for us in 2023.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point though about the difference between negative and just zero emissions, because I think it is, whilst people can understand it when they have the data in front of them, I think selling that as a story, which of course big brands is partly what they need to do, isn't it? They also need to be able to sell it on to their own consumers. So yeah, that makes sense that their focus is really, or your focus with them is more on it's just zero emissions in terms of the process. So let me just take you on a slightly different angle for a moment, which is around the kind of legislation and regulation supports or blockers, depending how you look at it, specifically in the CCU space. How, does it, when you look at the regulatory landscape, whether it's in the UK or whether it's in the US or other markets you might be eyeing up, is it supportive enough yet of CCU? And what would you like to see coming in to sort of really give reuse of CO2, so that waste stream being repurposed, more of the push that it needs?
So if we just have a starting point, is that regulation never keeps up with the pace of innovation and can end up being one of the great blockers to innovation. And to a certain extent, I feel sorry, or certainly sympathetic to the regulators, because innovation moves very fast and regulation doesn't, just by definition. But I think we're starting to see some change. There was a piece of legislation in Europe, which is now called, very excitingly, FPR, Fertiliser Product Regulation, that was rushed through in probably about 3 years. Now, in European terms, that is super fast. And the UK is adopting the bulk of FPR. So that has meant, in a very perverse way, what's happening for the last 20, 30 years is if you produced fertilizer using primary inputs, i.e. wasteful ammonia, you could get a passport to sell that in all 27 jurisdictions of Europe. Now, that was incentivizing bad practice. So Europe decided to change that in line with their green economy position, and they rushed that through. So there is some evidence of that. But then on the negative side, we've seen the United States lobbying very successfully against the mandatory Scope 3 obligations for the big corporates to release their data. Now, in Europe, I think if you're a company with more than $150 million or euros in revenues, you're obligated to make your Scope 3 emissions. The US was expected to do that at the end of last year, and the lobbying has been successful that has been pushed into the long grass. How long, I don't know. So there's a bit of thing. We obviously are looking at probably the most significant piece of legislation that the Biden administration put out, which was the Inflation Reduction Act, which then caused Europe to follow suit. And I think that has been helpful. Of course, for a lot of people in our industry, whether it's ag tech or climate tech, we worry about a change in administration in the United States as to whether that's been reversed in some way. And of course, that takes us back to the fundamental premise for innovation. We need some certainty. You need to be able to go through and say, fine, I've got a 10-year window that I know what the regulatory framework looks like, and I can then adjust my financial modeling and my business plan against that. So if there's any uncertainty, that just is not helpful, and we worry about whether that's going to be reversed in the United States come December.
So yes, policy certainty, no matter where a technology company is based, where a market is based, is coming up so strongly this year, which of course isn't surprising at all, because not just the US, not just the UK, but I mean, some 40–50% of the world's democracies are voting this year, and many of them climate some form of a us or them argument. So yeah, very, very, very true, and very pressing for a lot of people that there is a sense of continuity around that.
Without wishing to get political about it, but India, as you know, just on the verge of completing their process, and there is a sense of continuity, which I think is helpful, because the environment and the climate and the planet does not work in 5-year cycles. To see whatever administration it is, and as I say, this is not a political statement, to have some form of continuity, I think is extremely invaluable. So, and we know from our interactions in India, where we will be deploying with 3 big customers this year, the ability for us to understand what the regulatory environment thoughts were last year, and they'll be the same, if not better, this year, is hugely helpful. And we see other examples, not just India, but Ireland have got this huge issue around phosphates contamination coming from cattle slurry and other issues. Their ambitions are by far the most ambitious across Europe. Now that's really helpful. And again, we think that's going to be a policy that stays in place both in the North and in the Republic for some time to come. We can work with that.
Well, you mentioned India there and some new projects coming online. That neatly brings me back to a penultimate question for you then, which is about projects that are live and projects that you have coming down the pipe. You've already mentioned that you're working with brands like Pepsi, you're connected to major retailers like Tesco, but what's coming up for you? What projects are you able to talk to us about?
Some. But look, let me just give you the strategy of what we're doing. We have all of the jigsaw pieces on the table for the UK. As a business, it's absolutely critical that we make sure that our home market is absolutely rock solid and gold plated. And we have all those pieces, which is sites, offtake agreements. Again, if I looked at a number of these CCU technologies, we all have our challenges, but one of the things we've managed to do is to have off-takers where we get long-term, multi-year offtake agreements with some of our customers that give us contractual certainty, which allows us to accelerate faster. And that's why I say, there are a couple of lead steers that I've mentioned earlier who are absolutely showing the way in terms of giving contractual certainty. And most climate or ag technologies need that. So the UK and gold plating it is absolutely the first step. We could spend the next 10 years building a manufacturing units in India and the US and sales forces and all the things that go with it. But, without being too trite about it, the planet can't wait for that. So our view very much is to work with partners. And we know that sometimes franchisees or partners, strategic ventures, can have its challenges. But to be honest, that's a price worth paying to ensure that we accelerate it. So we've identified the party that we think will be our joint venture partner in India. We think we've got one in the United States, two in the United States. But part of it is also from these conversations that we're having with the C-suite at Pepsi is saying to them, look, we need you to ride shotgun for us. We're a small company based in Swindon. If you want us to go to India, if you want us to go to the United States, you're going to have to really ride alongside us. And that's another reason why I think Ramon's leadership is so insightful, because he's absolutely committed to do that. So if people have seen UK tech companies going into the United States and getting it wrong time after time after time, and not just in ag tech, but every industry. In ag terms, the US is at least 6 countries, maybe 7. So, unless we understand how to do it at that scale and that magnitude and that variance in terms of state regulations and all that stuff, well, it'll go horribly wrong. So we expect to go with our big brothers to help us to move that very quickly. And that's the other reason why we need to accelerate quite fast.
All right, well, that brings me around to the kind of closeout question, really, which is bearing in mind the audience for this, which includes not just other tech companies and industry and so forth, but also investors. What's next? Where are you in that kind of stage of funding scale, and so forth? What's on the boards for CCM?
Yeah, good timing. So we are just in the business end of a Series B funding round. So we have a lead. A number of followers. We're in the, as I say, we expect to close the lead this week. So the timing of your question is very good. Our own existing shareholders, who we have bled dry over the years, have come up with 3 times more investment, new investment than I'd anticipated. So again, they are showing huge resilience. The 2 key parts going forward is that a number of our customers are also being very forward-thinking in terms of how they're seeking to help us, not just in the regulatory move into new markets, but also in funding. But also a number of the big banks are, again, taking sustainable finance, as I've mentioned earlier, as the next great new frontier for them, and providing opportunities for significant project finance that would not necessarily have been available to an early stage technology like ours, but they're just showing leadership again. And I've mentioned the bank that I think is particularly running away with it. And I think that's critical in terms of the funding. So our raise is Series B is £8 million. But again, we're getting funding from the UK government that is extremely helpful and very advantageous, and likewise from customers. So, where we would probably thought we were going to have to raise 30 or 40 million, we're probably not going to have to raise that, because there are other channels that are being opened up because of this appetite to do sustainable finance. Great.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing more about that, and hopefully we can entice you back on perhaps a year or so down the line when you're through that phase and into how to put that next round of investment to good use. But Pavel, thank you so much for talking to us about your own drivers here, but also about the where CCM is at and the huge potential that you have lying ahead. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Alex. Bye-bye.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform and inspire. Reach out to us today.